The spring of 1945 saw the relentless Allied armies pouring across the Rhine via the newly secured bridgeheads like Remagen, accelerate into the industrial heartland of Germany. The strategic objective that now anchored the entire Western Front was the Ruhr Valley, the colossal economic engine of the Nazi regime. This region, a massive concentration of coal mines, steel mills, synthetic fuel plants, and armament factories, had fueled the German war machine since its inception. For the Allied High Command, neutralizing the Ruhr was the non-negotiable prerequisite for the total collapse of Germany. Its capture would not merely deny the enemy resources, it would sever the economic and logistical lifeblood of the German defense, ensuring that any remaining resistance would quickly starve of fuel and materiel. The Allied forces, spearheaded by the U.S., 1st and 9th Armies, advanced into the region with the firm expectation of encountering the fiercest, most fanatical resistance of the entire European campaign. The logic was simple. The Germans, fighting for their strategic life, would commit every available resource, every surviving tank, every last professional soldier, and every weapon, to the defense of their industrial heart. Intelligence reports indicated that massive formations of German troops, including remnants of the Wehrmacht and elite Waffen-SS units, were concentrated in the region, ready to turn the urban and industrial sprawl into an unassailable fortress, replicating the brutal, costly street fighting that characterized the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front. The American tankers and infantry prepared themselves for a prolonged, agonizing siege, a battle of extermination fought building by building, factory by factory. The strategic maneuver that brought the Allied forces to the gates of the Ruhr was a masterpiece of double envelopment, a massive pincer movement initiated by the Remagen bridgehead in the south and a powerful crossing further north. This maneuver, aimed at encircling German Army Group B, commanded by the formidable Field Marshal Walter Model, was executed with speed and overwhelming material superiority. The goal was to isolate the defending armies completely, cutting their supply lines and denying them any avenue of escape or reinforcement. The success of this pincer move was a direct consequence of the logistical breakthroughs of the previous months, confirming that the war was now defined by the immense, unstoppable momentum of the Allied supply machine. The industrial landscape itself was a character in this final act. The Ruhr Valley was a chaotic, often surreal maze of massive factory complexes, blast furnaces, dense worker housing, and sprawling rail yards. The Allied air forces had already subjected the region to years of relentless, systematic bombing, yet a massive amount of productive capacity remained, desperately guarded by the German command. The advance into this heavily scarred, smoking industrial terrain was the culmination of years of Allied planning, the final physical act of neutralizing the German war economy. The American soldiers entered the Ruhr Valley fully prepared for the final, brutal, high-cost battle, ready to fight a desperate enemy committed to a suicidal defense of the last economic jewel of the Reich. What they found, however, defied all strategic logic and expectation, revealing a terminal collapse that ran far deeper than simple battlefield defeat. The American armored columns that penetrated the defensive ring of the Ruhr Valley encountered a scene that starkly defied every tactical and strategic expectation. Instead of the fanatical, coordinated resistance anticipated, they found a German army in the advanced stages of total internal disintegration. The formidable Army Group B, numbering over 325,000 men, was not fighting. It was dissolving, trapped in a massive, bewildered pocket, starved of leadership, fuel, and supplies. The expected fortress had become a logistical and moral grave, transforming the final phase of the battle from a siege into a massive containment and mop-up operation. The sheer scale of the German collapse was rooted in the paralysis of command and logistics. Field Marshal Model, the commanding officer, was isolated, cut off from reliable communication with Hitler's headquarters, and left with an army that possessed no operational mobility. The relentless Allied advance and the collapse of the infrastructure meant that no fuel or ammunition reached the pocket. Tanks and motorized units, the core of Army Group B's strength, were immobilized, effectively becoming useless static fortifications. The lack of supply meant that the men were quickly reduced to foraging for survival, undermining any remaining military discipline or capacity for organized resistance. The American advance revealed a grim, surreal tableau of surrender. Tankers entered industrial suburbs expecting ambushes, only to find entire companies of German soldiers, veterans, Volkssturm, and young SS men alike, emerging from factories, rubble, and bunkers, ready to lay down their arms. The common factors were exhaustion, hunger, and a profound, overwhelming realization of the strategic futility of continued resistance. The moral will of the German soldier, which had sustained the fight for so long, finally broke when faced with the unassailable reality of complete encirclement and terminal supply denial. This sudden, mass surrender was a direct consequence of the systemic destruction of the German military's support structure. Unlike the final, high-cost battles of the Eastern Front, the forces trapped in the Ruhr pocket could not rely on local resources or external support. The surrounding countryside was controlled by overwhelming American mechanized divisions, and the sky was dominated by Allied air superiority, guaranteeing that any escape attempt was suicidal. The industrial fortress had become a logistical dead end, a gigantic holding pen that lacked the resources to sustain a fight that the command structure itself had abandoned. The Ruhr pocket quickly became the largest single mass surrender of German troops in the Western theater of the war, a profound strategic victory that effectively destroyed the last cohesive fighting force in the West. The American troops had entered the industrial heartland prepared for the brutality of Stalingrad. Instead, they found the silence of strategic defeat, a testament to the decisive power of superior logistics and the final, crushing psychological reality of utter isolation. The sight of hundreds of thousands of disarmed German troops streaming out of the valley was the visual confirmation that the war in the West was irrevocably lost. Attention! Forward recon! You've just witnessed a total strategic collapse where a formidable army dissolved into surrender, proving that logistics wins wars. The industrial fortress became a logistical grave. If the sheer scale of the Ruhr pocket surrender resonates with your strategic understanding, do not let this massive intelligence be lost. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these pivotal moments. And here is your operational query. What was the greatest psychological factor in the German surrender at the Ruhr? The relentless Allied air superiority, or the complete failure of Field Marshal Model's command to issue a coherent order? Drop your analysis in the comments below. Let the world hear the sound of the final strategic verdict. The tragedy of the Ruhr pocket is deeply intertwined with the fate of its commander, Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was one of Hitler's most formidable and respected field commanders, known for his fanatical loyalty, ruthless efficiency, and unwavering commitment to the hold-at-all-costs defensive doctrine. His isolation and subsequent actions within the collapsing pocket provide a unique and devastating insight into the final psychological and ethical breakdown of the German military's leadership. Model found himself trapped with his army, cut off from effective communication, and left to grapple with an impossible situation. The army under his command was functionally dead, starved and immobile, yet he was bound by the inflexible, delusional orders from Hitler's headquarters, mandating that there be no surrender. This moral and professional dilemma, between the military duty to preserve his men and the oath of loyalty to a failing regime, defined his final days. Model was a victim of the very system of absolute loyalty and rigid defense that he had so effectively embodied throughout the war. His actions within the pocket reflected this intense conflict. Initially, Model attempted to organize a desperate, futile breakout, ordering the remaining armored units and infantry to launch attacks toward the south. These efforts quickly collapsed due to the lack of fuel, the overwhelming American firepower, and the simple exhaustion of his men. Recognizing the strategic futility of continuing the fight, Model took the unprecedented step of disbanding his army rather than formally surrendering it. He released the younger soldiers and those who wished to go home from their oath, effectively authorizing a massive, decentralized surrender by default. saving hundreds of thousands of lives from a pointless final siege. However, Model himself refused to accept the finality of defeat. Bound by his personal oath to Hitler and the strict code of the field marshal, he could not bring himself to be captured by the enemy. His moral compass, warped by years of unquestioning loyalty, decreed that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. On April 21, 1945, near the town of Rattingen, after ensuring his men were released from their duty, Field Marshal Model took his own life. His final tragic act was the ultimate personal manifestation of the regime's collapse, a final despairing statement of the impossibility of reconciling personal honor with strategic defeat. The story of Model's isolation and suicide provided the final grim punctuation mark to the Battle of the Ruhr. It highlighted the complete moral and operational failure of the German command structure, which had left a seasoned leader with only two impossible choices: fanatical, meaningless annihilation, or self-destruction. The eventual surrender of the masses of German troops was therefore not an act of military cowardice, but an act of pragmatic self-preservation, implicitly sanctioned by the tragic, final gesture of their isolated commander. The decisive defeat of the German forces in the Ruhr pocket was not solely an armored and infantry victory. It was fundamentally secured by the years of relentless, systematic attrition inflicted by Allied air power. The Ruhr Valley, the heart of the German industrial economy, had been the primary target of Allied strategic bombing since 1942, and the final siege was merely the physical confirmation of a victory that had been won high above the industrial landscape. The legacy of the Allied bomber streams, the massive formations of B-17s, B-24s, and Lancasters, was etched into the ruined factories and infrastructure of the Ruhr. The long-term strategic goal of the bombing campaign was the total neutralization of the German war economy, particularly the synthetic fuel plants, the steel mills, and the massive rail network necessary for supply. By 1945, this goal was largely achieved. The German economy was running on fumes. Its capacity for large-scale armament production was crippled, and its ability to transport raw materials and finished goods was severely hampered. When the American armored divisions encircled the Ruhr, the armies trapped within were suffering from the consequence of this long-term air war. The lack of operational fuel, the ultimate reason for the immobility of Model's tanks, was a direct result of the continuous bombing of the oil plants. The lack of ammunition and supplies was a result of the destruction of the rail yards and the subsequent logistical paralysis. The Allied air forces, by crippling the German logistical and industrial base, had effectively won the battle before the ground troops arrived. During the final siege itself, Allied tactical air power played a crucial, devastating role. Fighter bombers dominated the skies over the pocket, constantly suppressing any localized German counterattack and systematically destroying any attempt by the Germans to organize an escape. The continuous threat from the air demoralized the already exhausted German soldiers, reinforcing the sense of utter isolation and futility. The sight of the Allied aircraft circling overhead was a constant, visual reminder of the overwhelming material and technological superiority of the enemy. The immense tonnage of bombs dropped on the Ruhr Valley over the course of the war was the ultimate silent weapon that defeated Army Group B. The destruction of the German industrial capacity was the non-negotiable strategic precondition for the final Allied victory in the West. The final spectacular mass surrender in the Ruhr Valley was the physical evidence of the cumulative strategic success of the air war, a victory secured by the systematic, relentless application of industrial power from the air, a power that the isolated German army had no means of countering. The American tankers entered the Ruhr expecting resistance, but they found only the ghost of an army, starved and paralyzed by the long-term strategic success of the bomber command. The confrontation in the Ruhr pocket presented a stark, absolute study in contrasts between the American and German armies, a visual and operational demonstration of the vast, unbridgeable chasm in logistics, resources, and morale that defined the final phase of the war in the West. The two forces, though geographically proximate, represented two fundamentally different strategic realities. The American army was a highly mobile, fully supplied, technologically superior force. Their tanks were fully fueled. Their infantry was well equipped and supplied by a robust, resilient logistical network stretching back to the operational port of Antwerp. Their morale was high, fueled by the continuous momentum of victory and the unwavering knowledge of air superiority. The American soldier was fighting with the confidence of a system that guaranteed support, supply, and evacuation. Their operational speed and tactical flexibility were derived directly from their overwhelming industrial and logistical depth. The German army was immobile, starved, and technologically depleted. The average German soldier in the Ruhr pocket was suffering from acute hunger, exhaustion, and the profound psychological damage of fighting a war that was irrevocably lost. Their equipment was immobilized due to lack of fuel and spare parts. Their command was in chaos, and their logistical support was non-existent. Their morale was shattered by the continuous losses, the lack of air cover, and the realization that their fanatical efforts were strategically meaningless. The German soldier was fighting with the desperation of a system that had failed him entirely. The contrast in resources was immediate and absolute. The American army could launch massive artillery bombardments and continuous airstrikes, utilizing an abundance of ammunition and fuel. The German forces could only rely on whatever ammunition they had personally carried into the pocket, with no hope of resupply. The American wounded were rapidly evacuated via air or motorized transport. The German wounded were often left to the care of local civilians or their comrades, with minimal medical aid. The final mass surrender, therefore, was not merely a military defeat. It was a triumph of the American system, a victory achieved by the logistical and industrial capacity of the United States. The German soldier, once a symbol of military efficiency, was reduced to an immobile, starving figure, a victim of the strategic choices that had failed to prioritize the necessary logistical foundation for total war. The two armies in the Ruhr represented the final dramatic clash between the industrialized, well-supported force committed to a systematic victory and the desperate, depleted force consumed by the systemic failures of its own command and economy. The sight of the two armies standing side by side in the Ruhr Valley was the ultimate, unassailable evidence of the strategic verdict that the war in the West was over. You have observed the devastating strategic verdict delivered by the Ruhr pocket, a victory of logistics and system over fanatical defense. If the utter strategic collapse of the German military machine resonates with your analysis, do not let this critical lesson be lost. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these monumental strategic failures. And here is your final intelligence task. Suggest the next great example of strategic command failure in Wei-2, perhaps the decisions leading up to Pearl Harbor, or the high-stakes choices in the North African campaign. For our deep dive analysis, your suggestions guide our strategic mission. The immediate aftermath of the mass surrender in the Ruhr pocket presented the American military with a massive, unprecedented logistical and security challenge: the immediate processing and containment of over 325,000 enemy combatants. The sheer scale of the surrender, achieved far sooner and with far less resistance than anticipated, required an immediate pivot in operational planning, transforming the focus from combat to massive prisoner management. The captured German soldiers were immediately herded into massive, hastily constructed open-air prisoner-of-war enclosures, often simple barbed wire perimeters in large fields. These enclosures, known officially as Rhein-Wiesenlager, Rhine Meadow camps, were a temporary but necessary measure to handle the influx of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The sheer speed of the advance and the size of the pocket meant that the American forces lacked the infrastructure, transport, and personnel to immediately move and house the captives in permanent facilities. The challenge of feeding and securing this massive, suddenly captive population was immense. The American Logistical Corps, already stretched to its limits supplying the advancing combat divisions, now had to divert massive amounts of food, water, and medical resources to the POW camps. While the conditions in these temporary camps were harsh, dictated by the lack of infrastructure and the immediate need to secure the perimeter, the systematic feeding and processing of the prisoners were accomplished with characteristic American efficiency, a testament to the organizational capacity that had won the logistical war. The intelligence gathered from the immediate wave of surrenders was invaluable. American interrogators worked quickly to separate officers, fanatical elements, and key technical personnel, gleaning critical intelligence about the remaining German defensive structure, troop movements, and the psychological state of the collapsing regime. The willingness of the German soldiers to talk, often openly discussing the strategic hopelessness of their position, provided the Allied command with a clear, devastating picture of the systemic breakdown that had occurred within the Ruhr pocket. The sheer scale of the capture cemented the strategic significance of the encirclement. The destruction of Army Group B was total, eliminating the last viable German fighting force in the West. The logistical challenge of managing the massive captive population was immense, but it was a logistical victory. The American system had successfully consumed the fighting power of the German army, and was now in the process of efficiently processing the remnants of the final defense. The sight of the hundreds of thousands of disarmed German soldiers in the Rhine meadow camps was the final, devastating visual confirmation that the war in the West was entirely and irrevocably won. While the prevailing image of the Ruhr pocket is the mass surrender, the encirclement also witnessed moments of desperate, fanatical final resistance. Localized battles fought by the most ideological, dedicated, and often youngest elements of the German forces. These pockets of resistance, largely composed of elite SS units and highly indoctrinated Hitler youth, defied Field Marshal Model's implicit surrender and fought on, highlighting the moral decay and delusion that gripped the most fanatical elements of the collapsing regime. These final pockets of resistance were often concentrated in urban centers and massive industrial complexes, where the terrain provided the necessary cover for a last-ditch defense. These forces, often cut off and supplied only by what they could scavenge, fought with a fierce, suicidal intensity, forcing the American forces into costly, close-quarters combat. The defense was characterized by the ruthless use of Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, snipers, and demolition charges, ensuring that every factory and every street corner was contested with immense brutality. The psychological dimension of these final battles was profound. The American troops, having witnessed the mass surrender, were often shocked and frustrated by the sudden, fierce intensity of these localized engagements. They were fighting an enemy that was strategically doomed, yet refusing to accept the finality of defeat, a moral position that made the fighting particularly brutal and high cost. The destruction of these final pockets required the systematic use of overwhelming American firepower, including tanks, flamethrowers, and specialized demolition teams, often resulting in the total annihilation of the German units involved. The resistance, while tactically fierce, was entirely strategically meaningless. These final, desperate battles consumed the lives of the most fanatical German elements, but they did nothing to alter the overall operational picture of the war. The immense logistical flow of the Allied armies continued unabated, and the capture of these final strongpoints was merely a matter of time and the systematic application of superior force. The fanatical resistance was the final, tragic, destructive expression of a broken ideology. The legacy of these last pockets of resistance remains a somber reminder of the human cost of delusion. The soldiers involved were often fighting not for a coherent strategic goal, but for the moral code dictated by a regime that had abandoned them entirely. Their sacrifice was immense and futile, a final punctuation mark to the catastrophic strategic failure of the German war effort. The American forces, having encountered the army of surrender, were forced to exterminate the last of the army of fanatical belief, ensuring that the total victory was complete. The Ruhr Valley, the target of the final encirclement, presented the Allied forces with a scene of profound economic ruin, a visual testament to the cumulative destruction inflicted by years of strategic bombing. The Valley of the Smokestacks, once the vibrant industrial heart of Europe, was a smoking, shattered landscape that confirmed the total strategic success of the Allied air war. The scale of the destruction was immense. While not all factories were completely leveled, the critical infrastructure, the rail yards, the power plants, the specialized synthetic oil facilities, and the water systems were comprehensively targeted and largely destroyed. The systematic nature of the bombing campaign ensured that even facilities that remained structurally intact were rendered functionally useless due to the disruption of transport, power, and fuel supply. The German economy, starved of its industrial lifeblood, was running on its final fumes. The strategic importance of this economic ruin cannot be overstated. The destruction of the Ruhr eliminated the German capacity for large-scale coordinated armament production, guaranteeing that the military forces remaining would be chronically short of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The loss of the Ruhr meant that the German economy could no longer sustain a modern war effort, even if the manpower and logistical issues were somehow solved. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, often criticized for its high cost and lack of immediate tactical gains, achieved its ultimate strategic goal in the systematic destruction of the German industrial heartland. The American advance into the Ruhr was thus an advance into the graveyard of the German war economy. The industrial capacity that had launched the Blitzkrieg and terrorized Europe was now a silent, immobile mass of twisted steel and shattered concrete. This profound economic collapse was the non-negotiable strategic precondition for the final mass surrender. The German soldier fighting in the ruined valley was surrounded by the physical evidence of his nation's strategic defeat, facing an enemy whose economic power was unassailable. The final silent lesson of the Ruhr Valley was the supremacy of industrial power in total war. The eventual Allied victory was secured not just by the courage of the infantry, but by the overwhelming industrial capacity to mobilize, supply, and ultimately destroy the enemy's economic foundation. The shattered smokestacks of the Ruhr stood as the ultimate grim monument to the strategic success of the Allied industrial war machine, confirming that the path to victory was paved with steel and coal. The logistics of managing the massive prisoner of war population from the Ruhr pocket presented the Allied forces with an immense, unprecedented administrative cost of victory. The systematic processing, feeding, and securing of over 325,000 captives required an immediate diversion of resources, personnel, and planning that highlighted the vast organizational capacity of the American military. The challenge was primarily one of scale and speed. The sheer number of prisoners, captured in a matter of weeks, overwhelmed the existing POW infrastructure. The establishment of the temporary Rhine meadow camps was a necessary but difficult improvisation, requiring combat engineers to quickly transition from building bridges to erecting massive barbed wire enclosures. The immediate priority was security, preventing escapes and maintaining order within the densely populated camps. The feeding and maintenance of the captive population were a massive logistical drain. The American supply system had to divert significant resources of food and water to the camps, often sourced from their own strategic stockpiles. Medical teams, already stretched by combat casualties, were deployed to manage the health crises within the camps, treating malnutrition, disease, and combat wounds. The German army's collapse was so total that the responsibility for the sustenance and health of its defeated troops immediately fell onto the conquering army. The successful management of the Ruhr POWs was a profound demonstration of the organizational superiority of the American system. The capacity to absorb, process, and sustain a population larger than many major American cities, while simultaneously maintaining the continuous offensive against the remaining German forces, was an administrative and logistical triumph. The systematic processing, including medical screening, interrogation, and subsequent transport to permanent facilities, was executed with characteristic efficiency. The legacy of the POW logistics in the Ruhr confirms the final strategic lesson. The war was won by the army that could sustain the fight, and then efficiently manage the consequences of the enemy's total collapse. The ability to administer and manage the immense captive population was the final silent demonstration of the American logistical and industrial capacity, a capacity that had won the war and was now successfully managing the peace. The immense administrative cost of victory was a final necessary burden that the American system was uniquely equipped to bear. The total collapse of the German military in the Ruhr pocket left a profound, lasting imprint on military strategy, confirming the shift to a new strategic paradigm where industrial capacity and logistical cohesion are the non-negotiable determinants of victory in total war. The entire operation, from the initial encirclement to the final mass surrender, serves as the ultimate case study in the consequences of strategic imbalance. The lasting lesson is the absolute supremacy of logistics and material. The fact that a massive professional army could be reduced to mass surrender not by direct combat annihilation, but by logistical starvation, fundamentally changed the way military strategists viewed continental warfare. The power of the Allied armies was not just in their tanks, but in the seamless, resilient supply chain that kept those tanks fueled and firing indefinitely. The failure of the German blitzkrieg was sealed in the collapse of the industrial support system. The strategic paradigm shifted from a focus on individual, tactical genius to the primacy of the system. The German defeat was not due to the lack of courage of its soldiers, but the failure of its industrial base, its strategic planning, and its command cohesion. The Allied victory was a victory of systemic resilience, organizational efficiency, and the massive coordinated utilization of industrial resources, a triumph that could be replicated and sustained. The legacy of the Ruhr pocket became the template for post-war military thought, cementing the principle that strategic ambition must be subordinate to logistical reality. The massive human cost and the sudden total nature of the surrender highlighted the vulnerability of any military force that cannot sustain its operational capacity against a determined, industrially superior foe. The sight of the massive, immobile German armies in the Ruhr confirmed that the age of the military machine was defined by its logistical tail. The ultimate triumph in the Ruhr was the triumph of the arsenal of democracy. The American industrial and logistical system had successfully projected its power across the Atlantic, sustained a continental-scale offensive, and ultimately strangled the fighting capacity of its enemy. The legacy of the Ruhr pocket remains a chilling, unassailable strategic verdict. The war was won in the factories and the supply depots long before the final mass surrender confirmed the inevitable. The total collapse of German Army Group B within the Ruhr pocket provided a unique and devastating spectacle for the German civilian population trapped within the vast encirclement. These civilians, who had endured years of strategic bombing and pervasive Nazi propaganda promising ultimate victory, were forced to become direct, immediate witnesses to the profound terminal disintegration of the Wehrmacht. Their shock, fear, and subsequent shift in loyalty formed a crucial, tragic subplot to the military drama of the final siege. The initial days of the encirclement were characterized by chaos and fear. The breakdown of command and the immobilization of German military vehicles led to widespread confusion. Civilians watched as soldiers, once symbols of Nazi power and discipline, discarded their weapons, stripped off their uniforms, and joined the frantic search for food and civilian clothing to evade capture. The sight of massive numbers of demoralized, starving soldiers was the ultimate, undeniable refutation of the propaganda that had sustained the home front for so long. The psychological impact of seeing an entire army dissolve before their eyes was immense, shattering the last vestiges of belief in the regime's inevitable victory. The civilian population quickly assumed the immense, unintended burden of survival and triage. With the German military command paralyzed, local infrastructure and services ceased to function. Civilians became responsible for their own immediate safety, often tending to the German wounded who could not be evacuated, and organizing local resistance against the remaining fanatical Nazi elements or isolated pockets of SS that continued to demand pointless, suicidal defense. Local leaders, emerging from the pre-war structures, often took immense personal risks to sabotage Hitler's final scorched earth orders, protecting factories and essential services from destruction. The American advance into the Ruhr was greeted not just by mass surrender, but by a profound, immediate shift in the civilian posture. Having seen the evidence of the German military's total defeat, many civilians were ready to cooperate with the conquering forces, offering information, and seeking stability and the restoration of order. The speed and decisiveness of the American advance, coupled with the clear logistical superiority, the sight of endless, fully supplied American convoys, served as a powerful final act of psychological warfare, confirming the futility of any further resistance. The legacy of the civilian shock in the Ruhr was the final irreversible destruction of the Nazi myth. The civilians became the first necessary witnesses to the ultimate strategic verdict, confirming that the German war effort had collapsed, not due to betrayal or a lack of courage, but due to the systematic failure of its leadership and the overwhelming, unassailable power of the Allied war machine. The end of the war for the German civilians in the Ruhr was a period of immediate, terrifying danger, followed by the sobering, profound realization that the future of their nation now lay entirely in the hands of the victor. The capture of the Ruhr Valley, while a strategic victory for the ground forces, immediately presented the Allied Engineering Corps with a monumental, non-negotiable task: repairing the shattered industrial infrastructure to prevent famine, disease, and prolonged civilian chaos. The true measure of the American logistical and technical supremacy was demonstrated not in the destruction of the enemy, but in the immediate, systematic capacity to rebuild the essential lifeline of the conquered territory. The challenge was immense. Years of systematic Allied strategic bombing, followed by the final localized German attempts at scorched earth sabotage, had left the Ruhr's infrastructure in ruins. The vital arteries, the massive rail yards, the major road networks, the crucial water pumping stations, and the electrical grids were extensively damaged, rendering the massive population of the industrial valley reliant entirely on the conquering army for sustenance. The rapid restoration of these services was not merely a humanitarian objective, it was a military necessity to ensure stability and prevent the massive administrative cost of managing a starving, diseased captive population. The American engineers, already fatigued from the relentless pace of bridge building and road clearance across the Rhine, immediately pivoted to this immense civilian task. Their efforts were characterized by speed, improvisation, and overwhelming resources. Massive rail repair teams were brought forward to restore the main rail lines, essential for transporting supplies into the Ruhr and moving the massive captive population out. Specialized teams worked under immense pressure to repair the critical water supply and electrical grids, often utilizing salvaged German equipment and materials. The task was compounded by the continuous risk of unexploded ordnance, UXO, and delayed action demolition charges left behind by the retreating German forces. The success of the engineering effort was absolute. Within weeks, the essential rail lines were partially operational, allowing the massive influx of humanitarian and logistical supplies necessary to stabilize the region. The methodical, organized effort to restore infrastructure provided a profound contrast to the chaos and destruction that defined the final days of the German regime. The systematic capacity to repair and rebuild became a powerful final act of psychological warfare, demonstrating to the civilian population the unassailable power of the American system. The legacy of the engineering triumph in the Ruhr was the practical application of American logistical supremacy, the ability to rapidly pivot from total combat to total reconstruction, sustaining both the advance of the main combat force and the rehabilitation of the massive occupied territory, was a testament to the depth, flexibility, and organizational genius of the American engineering and logistical corps. The repair of the Ruhr's lifeline was the final necessary act that cemented the strategic verdict of the war. Attention, Engineer Corps, you've just witnessed the pivot from warfighting to rebuilding, the true measure of a superior system. The capture was a military win, but the repair of the lifeline was a logistical triumph. If the sheer scale of the Ruhr's infrastructure challenge resonates with your strategic mind, do not let this critical intelligence be lost. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these vital logistical feats. And here is your operational query. What was the single most vital piece of infrastructure repaired by the U.S. Army in the Ruhr? The main rail yards, the Rhine bridges, or the water pumping stations? Drop your analysis in the comments below. We rely on your strategic insights. The immediate economic reality in the Ruhr pocket following the mass surrender was the emergence of a chaotic, desperate black market economy, a struggle for scraps that highlighted the profound scarcity and disruption caused by the final collapse of the German state. This economic anarchy was a direct consequence of the destruction of the official supply channels and the sudden presence of hundreds of thousands of disarmed, hungry soldiers and civilians. The core of the black market was the desperate trade of essential commodities: food, cigarettes, which became the dominant currency, alcohol, and most importantly, fuel, were traded at astronomical, hyper-inflated rates. The German Reichsmark was virtually worthless. The only reliable currency was the American cigarette or the simple exchange of goods. This raw, unregulated economy was fueled by the sudden availability of military surplus, German equipment and supplies abandoned by the retreating Wehrmacht, and the need of the captive population to secure sustenance outside of the official, rationed Allied supply system. The complexity of the black market was immense, often involving local civilians, disarmed German soldiers, and occasionally opportunistic elements from the Allied support units. The trade was often risky, carried out under the constant threat of Allied military police patrols and the severe penalties imposed for illicit transactions. Yet for many in the Ruhr, the black market was the only viable means of survival, providing access to food and medicine that the shattered official German infrastructure could no longer provide. The strategic consequence of the black market was twofold. On one hand, it allowed the local civilian population to survive the initial period of acute scarcity and dislocation, acting as a functional, if dangerous, substitute for the failed German state. On the other hand, it placed a continuous, administrative burden on the Allied military, who were forced to dedicate resources to policing the vast area and attempting to maintain economic order amidst the chaos. The trade in military surplus also posed security risks, as weapons, uniforms, and valuable equipment fell into the hands of a fractured, disorganized population. The psychological dimension of the black market was equally profound. It stripped away the final pretense of state authority and forced the population into a raw, individualistic struggle for survival. The sight of former officers and dedicated SS men trading their final possessions for a loaf of bread was the ultimate poignant symbol of the total collapse of the Nazi state and the social order it had imposed. The economic chaos in the Ruhr Valley was the final, grim expression of strategic defeat, a testament to the destructive power of a war that had consumed the economic and logistical foundations of an entire nation. The suicide of Field Marshal Walter Model within the Ruhr pocket remains the most poignant and tragic personal narrative of the entire battle, serving as the ultimate illustration of the moral and strategic failure of the regime he served. Model's fate was the direct consequence of a system that demanded absolute loyalty, but offered its commanders only two impossible choices: meaningless annihilation or profound personal disgrace. Model's final decision to disband his army rather than formally surrender was a profound act of moral and pragmatic triage. Recognizing the strategic futility of continued resistance and the guaranteed, pointless slaughter of his men under Hitler's orders, he chose to preserve the lives of his soldiers by releasing them from their oath. This courageous decision, made in direct violation of the Führer's explicit command, stands as a quiet, final rejection of the regime's destructive fanaticism. He chose the ethical imperative of saving his men over the delusional demands of his oath. However, Model's subsequent suicide highlighted the complete psychological entrapment imposed by the Nazi code of honor. As a field marshal who had sworn a personal oath to Hitler and was committed to the highest standards of the Wehrmacht tradition, he found the concept of capture or surrender personally unbearable. His act was not one of despair over military defeat. Model was a professional soldier who understood the strategic reality, but a final, tragic assertion of personal honor, dictated by a moral code that provided no functional pathway for survival in a total war that had reached its conclusion. The contrasting fates of Model and the 325,000 soldiers he released provided the final, powerful verdict on the German command structure. The vast majority of the German troops released from their oath chose the rational path of surrender, prioritizing life over a meaningless final sacrifice. Model, the symbol of the old military order, chose the path of self-annihilation, trapped by the rigid, outdated code of honor that his own actions had implicitly rejected. His tragedy was the ultimate personal cost of the regime's failure to provide a moral or military framework for defeat. The legacy of Model's final command was a crucial contribution to the Allied victory. His decision to disband the army saved the American forces from a prolonged, brutal, and high-cost siege of the Ruhr's urban centers, ensuring that the war in the West concluded swiftly. His fate remains a somber monument to the immense psychological pressure placed upon the German leadership, a final chilling testament to the dangers of absolute loyalty in the face of absolute strategic failure. The ultimate personal tragedy of the Ruhr was the final solitary gesture of a leader caught between the duty to his men and the demands of a failing state. The American advance through the Ruhr Valley was constantly hampered by the imminent threat of unexploded legacy, the systematic, widespread sabotage and demolition efforts enacted by the retreating German forces. While the German command failed to destroy the entire Ruhr industrial complex, due to successful counter-sabotage and the Nero Decree resistance, the extensive demolition of the necessary infrastructure created a high-risk environment that slowed the American advance and consumed immense engineering resources. The German strategy of denial focused heavily on transport and energy infrastructure. Rail lines were cut, junctions were destroyed, and, crucially, major road and rail bridges were systematically demolished to slow the American armored pursuit. This ensured that the American Engineer Corps, fatigued from the continuous bridge building across the Rhine, had to dedicate massive resources to rapid repair and bridge construction within the Ruhr itself. Every advancing American unit had to be preceded by combat engineers, constantly clearing mines, dismantling booby traps, and constructing temporary bridges to maintain the necessary operational tempo. The most insidious threat came from the delayed action demolition charges and mines. The German demolition teams, operating under strict orders, used highly sophisticated time delay fuses and anti-handling devices, turning the captured territory into a minefield that posed a constant, lethal threat to the advancing troops and the subsequent logistical flow. The systematic clearance of these hidden weapons was a painstaking, dangerous process that continued long after the main combat had passed, inflicting high non-combat casualties on the clearance teams. The massive unexploded legacy was the final, tactical weapon of the retreating Wehrmacht. They could not stop the American tanks, but they could slow the advance, consume the enemy's logistical resources, and extract a high price in non-combat casualties. The American response, characterized by the massive, efficient deployment of specialized demolition and clearance teams, was a final demonstration of their superior logistical organization. The ability to rapidly clear and repair the extensive damage guaranteed that the German strategy of denial ultimately failed to achieve its primary objective of stalling the final offensive. The final legacy of the sabotage was the confirmation of the immense resource disparity. The German forces expended irreplaceable materiel and specialized manpower in a desperate attempt to destroy their own infrastructure, an effort that only succeeded in temporarily inconveniencing the vast American logistical machine. The American Engineer Corps, backed by the industrial output of the arsenal of democracy, could replace bridges and repair rail lines far faster than the collapsing German state could destroy them. The unexploded legacy of the Ruhr was a final grim testament to the strategic futility of demolition against overwhelming industrial superiority. The military victory achieved by the American armored forces in the Ruhr pocket was significantly aided by a critical, often overlooked factor: the counter-sabotage and local defiance enacted by German citizens and local authorities who opposed Hitler's final destructive orders. While the narrative often focuses on the military clash, the actions of these local underground elements provided the Allied advance with a crucial strategic advantage, mitigating the damage and accelerating the final surrender. The core of this local defiance was the widespread rejection of the Nero Decree. the final scorched earth order. Many local industrial managers, engineers, and civilian leaders recognized the catastrophic long-term consequences of destroying the remaining infrastructure and essential services. They actively delayed, sabotaged, or simply ignored the orders issued by fanatical Nazi elements, ensuring that vital assets, power stations, water pumps, and critical industrial machinery remained intact for the post-war future. This passive, yet profoundly effective resistance was a moral and practical victory against the regime's final delusion. The local resistance also played a key role in the final mass surrender. Recognizing the futility of continued resistance and the guaranteed slaughter of the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm troops, many civilian leaders and local commanders facilitated communication with the advancing American forces. Their efforts helped organize the mass surrender points, reducing the chaos and ensuring that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were safely processed without necessitating a prolonged, high-cost final siege of the urban centers. These local acts of triage saved countless lives, both German and American. Furthermore, local civilians and resistance groups provided invaluable real-time intelligence to the advancing American units. They directed American troops around localized pockets of fanatical SS resistance, identified key German command posts, and provided critical information regarding the location of mines and demolition charges. This intelligence dramatically increased the speed and safety of the American advance, allowing the armored divisions to execute their final encircling maneuver with overwhelming efficiency. The local population, witnessing the total collapse of the German military, acted pragmatically to secure their own future and the preservation of their communities. The legacy of the local underground resistance in the Ruhr demonstrates that the final collapse of the German military was not merely a defeat of arms, but a total societal breakdown. The loyalty to the regime dissolved in the face of imminent destruction, replaced by a pragmatic desire for survival and the restoration of order. The actions of these unsung local heroes were a critical final contribution to the Allied victory, accelerating the end of the war and preserving the essential industrial and civic infrastructure of the region. The catastrophic manpower crisis that defined the final phase of the German defense was tragically illustrated by the immense presence of the very young and the very old among the forces trapped in the Ruhr pocket. The sight of Hitler Youth and elderly Volkssturm soldiers alongside the professional troops provided the American forces with a chilling, immediate visual testament to the terminal consumption of German fighting capacity and the moral decay of the collapsing regime. The Hitler Youth, often barely teenagers, were thrown into combat with minimal training, armed with basic weapons like Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and fueled by a desperate, fanatical indoctrination. Their presence on the front lines was a profound ethical failure of the German command, sacrificing the nation's youth in a futile, lost cause. While their resistance was often fierce and localized, a product of intense loyalty and brainwashing, it was fundamentally ineffective against the combined arms and overwhelming experience of the American armored divisions. Their eventual capture or death was a tragic inevitability, an unnecessary loss of life dictated by the delusion of the regime. Conversely, the Volkssturm, composed of men deemed too old for professional service, often included veterans of the First World War or middle-aged factory workers. Their commitment, driven by a profound, if misguided, sense of duty to their homeland, was often characterized by a lack of training, obsolete equipment, and a deep, weary understanding of the hopelessness of their position. Many of these older men were the first to surrender, lacking the fanaticism of the youth and prioritizing survival over a pointless final sacrifice. The presence of these two extremes, children and old men, within the Ruhr pocket defense, was the final, unassailable proof of the Wehrmacht's total manpower attrition. The regular fighting formations, the professional corps that had sustained the war, were decimated, leaving the defense reliant on these desperate, final reserves. The American advance was often hampered more by the ethical dilemma of engaging children in combat than by the actual military effectiveness of the resistance they encountered. The moral weight of the conflict, The immense tragedy of facing such ill-equipped final forces was keenly felt by the American troops. The final surrender of these mixed-age forces in the Ruhr was a massive administrative challenge, requiring the immediate separation of the indoctrinated youth from the older, less fanatical elements. The sight of these final, desperate soldiers marching into captivity was the ultimate poignant symbol of the German military's collapse, confirming that the entire nation, young and old, had been consumed by the insatiable demands of a war that had been strategically lost years earlier. The advance of the American armored forces through the Ruhr Valley was an advance through a landscape profoundly scarred by years of relentless strategic air war. The ruined factories, the shattered transport hubs, and the silent, immobile industrial complexes presented a grim, indelible testament to the immense, cumulative effectiveness of the Allied bombing campaign. The physical reality of the Ruhr's destruction provided the ultimate visible context for the collapse of the German military capacity. The systematic destruction achieved by the massive formations of B-17s, B-24s, and Lancasters was comprehensive. While the bombing campaign often struggled with pinpoint accuracy, its success lay in the total coordinated attack on the infrastructure that sustained the factories, the power grids, the water supply systems, and, most critically, the immense rail network that transported coal, raw materials, and finished armaments. The destruction of the transport hubs was the most decisive factor, guaranteeing that even structurally intact factories could not function due to the lack of fuel and raw materials. The sight of the ruined factories provided the final, immediate answer to the puzzle of the mass surrender. The armies trapped within the pocket were surrounded by the physical evidence of their nation's industrial failure. The very infrastructure that should have supplied their tanks with fuel and their rifles with ammunition was a smoking, immobile ruin. This visual proof of overwhelming Allied superiority fueled the mass surrender, confirming the strategic hopelessness of their position. The American tankers were literally driving through the graveyard of the German war economy. The legacy of the strategic air war in the Ruhr was the absolute confirmation of the primacy of industrial targeting in total war. The destruction of the German economic engine was the necessary precondition for the rapid final victory. The immense effort and resources expended by the Allied air forces over the years paid off decisively in the spring of 1945. The German military's defeat was secured not just by the forces on the ground, but by the relentless, systematic application of overwhelming industrial power from the air, ensuring that the economy that had launched the war was utterly destroyed by the time the final battles commenced. The shattered smokestacks and the ruined rail yards of the Ruhr Valley stand as the ultimate grim monument to the effectiveness of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, confirming that the economic foundation of a nation is the most vulnerable and critical target in a war of attrition. The final surrender in the Ruhr was the total consumption of the industrial machine that had sustained the Nazi regime. The intense final nature of the combat in the Ruhr pocket, particularly the localized fighting against fanatical elements, raised profound questions of moral ambiguity and the conduct of warfare in the face of strategic collapse. While the mass surrender was processed efficiently, the localized resistance, particularly from SS units and the Hitler Youth, occasionally led to brutal, high-cost encounters that tested the moral discipline of the advancing American troops. The presence of the Hitler Youth on the battlefield created a complex ethical dilemma for the American soldiers. Engaging children in combat, even when they were firing anti-tank weapons and fighting with fanaticism, was a profound moral burden. The American command had to balance the need for operational security and the protection of its troops against the ethical revulsion of fighting children. The tragic reality was that the fanaticism of the youth, rooted in deep indoctrination, often necessitated their annihilation or capture under fire, a brutal necessity dictated by the regime's moral decay. Furthermore, the relentless no-surrender resistance of the most fanatical SS elements raised moral ambiguities concerning the treatment of the final pockets of resistance. These units, known for their war crimes and their refusal to adhere to the laws of war, often fought to the death or attempted suicide attacks, forcing the American forces to operate with extreme caution and firepower. The final reduction of these strong points was often a high-cost, brutal affair, blurring the ethical lines of combat when facing an enemy that deliberately violated the established conventions of war. The subsequent POW management in the temporary Rhine Meadow camps also raised immediate ethical and moral concerns. While the American forces successfully managed the logistics of feeding and securing the vast captive population, the sheer scale and the chaotic nature of the surrender meant that conditions were harsh, leading to questions about the immediate living conditions and the subsequent treatment of the captives. The moral burden of managing the entire defeated German army, including the fanatical elements, was immense, requiring the constant commitment of resources and administrative oversight. The legacy of moral ambiguity in the Ruhr is a crucial reminder that the end of a total war is rarely clean or simple. The final victories are often purchased at a profound ethical cost, dictated by the brutal choices forced upon the combatants by the collapsing enemy. The American military, while maintaining overall ethical standards, was forced to confront the darkest aspects of the German regime's moral decay, ensuring that the total victory was tinged by the immense, complex human and ethical toll of the final battles. The total collapse of the German military in the Ruhr pocket left an enduring, unseen legacy: the preservation of the future, the immediate, systematic effort to save the essential industrial and civic infrastructure necessary for the post-war reconstruction of Germany, and the subsequent stability of Europe. The final actions in the Ruhr were not just about winning the battle, they were about securing the peace. The most critical element of this unseen legacy was the successful counter-sabotage effort. The local German resistance and the pragmatic actions of the American engineers effectively neutralized Hitler's final suicidal orders, the Nero Decree, ensuring that key assets, factories, transport links, and utility systems remained intact. This preservation of infrastructure was the non-negotiable precondition for the subsequent economic recovery of Germany and its capacity to eventually transition to a democratic, peaceful state. Had the Nero Decree been fully executed, the humanitarian crisis and the long-term economic collapse in Europe would have been exponentially worse. The immense POW management effort also contributed to this legacy. The rapid systematic processing and securing of the 325,000 captive soldiers saved these men from a pointless final slaughter, preserving a massive, vital manpower pool that would be essential for the reconstruction of Germany. The American logistical system, by prioritizing the feeding and securing of the captive population, guaranteed that this generation of German men would survive the collapse and contribute to the rebuilding of their nation. The logistical management of the surrender was an act of far-sighted strategic foresight. The ultimate, lasting legacy of the Ruhr pocket is the confirmation of the moral and strategic high ground of the Allied system. The American capacity to combine immense military power with the pragmatic effort to rebuild, restore order, and preserve human life, immediately following the final battles, provided a profound contrast to the destructive moral bankruptcy of the collapsing regime. The final victory was secured by the American military, but the future was secured by the American engineers and the administrators who prioritized the stabilization and reconstruction of the conquered territory. The total collapse in the Ruhr was the final devastating act that proved the ultimate strategic verdict. The war was won by the army that could sustain the fight, manage the consequences of the enemy's total defeat, and secure the foundation for a peaceful future. The preservation of the infrastructure and the preservation of human life in the Ruhr Valley were the final necessary steps that cemented the total triumph of the Allied war effort.